And I got into autism by accident in 1995 when I was finishing my residency at Mass General, and I got handed a bunch of brain images that had been collected by Isabel Rappin and Tony Philippine and a bunch of people who were trying to look for the parts of the brain that would explain the behaviors in autism. So I got handed this pile of brains. And a lot of the work had already been done, and I had to do some of the rest of the work. And I thought that I was interested in the neurobiology of emotion at that time. And the autism stuff seemed kind of humdrum, and the literature was dry, and the work I was doing was very tedious. And then as I started having my own practice and seeing patients, I started experiencing that whatever they had been telling me about autism was not what was walking in the door with each patient and each family. And just taking more of a history and getting more and more medical about the history. And that went on for several years. And then in 1999, two things happened. One of them was there was a pivotal conference in New York City on environmental influences on brain development. And I remember I have a long history of being involved in environmental stuff because of my mother, who was very involved in this, and also just because of living in the world. And people had discouraged me from going into child neurology because they said it had nothing to do with that part of my interest. And I said, I don't care, I'm interested in children in the brain, and I'm going to do it anyway. And lo and behold, it turns out that it has everything to do with it. And that conference was the first time there was a day-long group of people talking about it, and it knocked my socks off. And the other thing was really, actually there was a whole other thing that I got exposed to all kinds of controversies at that time around genetically engineered food, and found out that there was no research, people hadn't done any of the homework, and they were just selling this stuff. I got asked to comment on Gerber's baby food had removed genetically modified ingredients from their product in Europe, but they had left it in here. And so I was given all the stuff and asked to look at the literature to find out what the literature said. I found there wasn't any literature. They hadn't published anything. And so we had a press conference in this lovely French restaurant on the Upper West Side of Manhattan with a bunch of chefs who were there, and asked Gerber baby food how come they had taken the ingredients out in Europe and not here. And 5 weeks later, they caved, and they took it out here, and it was front page Wall Street Journal news. And that was a really impressive experience for me. I didn't organize it, that was how I got involved in this. For a number of years before I got involved in autism, I wound up, because I actually own a farm because my father lived on it and he died, and he left it to me. And I watched the big dairy industry come in and knock out all the little farmers because they weren't buying milk from these guys. To the point where actually a lot of these little farmers went organic because it was the only way kids could survive. You never would have dreamed that these are the guys who would have gone organic. So watching this and then seeing the next move, which was the genetic engineering, it was very personal for me. And then when I began to encounter, and I also went to a conference in Rome that year, and it was on autism, and I went to present my brain imaging finding, and this guy whom I had never seen stood up. His name was Paul Shattuck, and I actually have long since gotten to know him, but it took me 2 years to chase him down after this conference. And he showed one slide which completely exploded everything I had ever thought about autism. And what it was a picture of proteins, tracings of the proteins in urine. And I'm a child neurologist, so we study metabolic things that affect the brain. We treat those things. And next to metabolic specialists, we're supposed to be the ones who know more about metabolism and moving inside GI. And there were all kinds of abnormal substances in the urine, and I'm like, this is not what they've been telling me. Any condition, and I don't even care how accurate the slide is, the very idea that there is a metabolic disturbance in the urine puts this condition in a different category than I was taught, period. That's just it, period. So now we have to understand, we know in child neurology that genes affect everything in your body. There aren't brain genes and the genes are genes, and they turn on and off all over in different places of the body. So I realized that this was a similar kind of category as a metabolic disease, where there were things going on in the whole body that affected the brain. But then the question is working out the details, and that's what I've been doing ever since. It isn't so easy. But that was a really revelatory moment to me. So basically, all within the span of 2 or 3 months, I had it's a whole body thing. There's something, how did he say it in Shakespeare? Something rotten in Denmark regarding the food system, and that the environment was a mess. And this all happened within 2 or 3 months, and I've been, again, living with it. And so what you're going to get is where I have come to over the last 10 years in thinking about this based on everything from my research to other people's research to much more. And I've come to the conclusion that autism is a crisis of the brain-body system in a planet that's also in crisis. And this brain-body system, which we all know is very, very delicate when it develops, is being impacted by things that have never before been on the face of the earth. And I'm talking chemicals and radiation and weird things that we do to our food in order to make it stay on shelves for 2 or 3 years. As opposed to things that we do to make it better for us. And what is this doing to our children, and are these children just a harbinger of what it's doing to the rest of us, and not only humans? And so I have a little blurb here. Evolutionary unprecedented stressors are overwhelming brain and body systems, particularly for children in development, and particularly for the children who, if you're here for a child, have brought you here. And to deal with this, we require partnerships of unprecedented types to respond effectively to the impacts on children, adults, families, schools, community, culture, and the world. So I'm here to give you a context for the belly is the beast. Because the belly isn't the beast because the belly decided to be the beast. The belly is the beast because the whole, now you get to be the belly, but you're in the belly of something much bigger, and that's what's making the belly the beast. So let me just start with the traditional, conventional definition of autism. Many or most of you may have seen this, but if not, it's important to know about it. Autism is currently defined as in a psychiatric manual by behavioral criteria. DSM-4 is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, version 4 of the American Psychiatric Association, and there is version 5 in the works right now, DSM-5. I believe they're going to get rid of Asperger's syndrome, and they're going to have just continuous metrics of severity across multiple dimensions that will, because there is no evidence that Asperger's is any different than autism. But if you notice, and that, by the way, that may change, so don't go around saying that that's completely authoritative, but because they haven't finalized it. So until it's finalized, that's the way, but I sat next to somebody at dinner who's all involved in that's what she was saying. So it's basically gossip, what I just told you, but I think it's highly likely gossip. So in order to define autism, you have to have impaired social interaction, delayed and disordered communication, which in many cases involves language, but not in everybody, and a markedly restricted repertoire of interest and activity, which can include everything from flapping your hands to being able to give a college-level lecture on dinosaurs when you're 3. So, and I had a patient once who was brilliant at 6, and when he was 2.5, he was a savant about the ceiling fan collection at Home Depot. And he could just stand there and tell people fans and explain all the specs of the fan. So that was a very interesting way of transforming life and watch the spinning into this whole other universe. So then there's all these things which people have called secondary. They assume that because we define autism as behavioral, that those actually are really biologically the core things, which is actually a leap. Just because we see them most easily doesn't mean that they're the core, true core. So there's all these other things going on, and they don't go on in everybody. Seizures don't go on in everybody, but they're pretty darn common. Cognitive deficit, sensory motor issues. Some surveys show as much as 100% of kids having sensory issues, and close to that for sleep. Immune, GI, food allergies, they're all considered secondary.